So in this session, we're taking a look at the way that modern critics look at the Gospels. Not quite the same as the way that critics used to, but it's certainly got its basis in that. And it's an out-and-out attack on the reliability of the Gospels. And actually, the evidence doesn't support the critics. They sit there and say, this is what scholars tell us. Well, depends which scholars. So we'll look at the models that we have. I'm going to call the model I picked the standard model. Some people would call it the traditional model, but it's the idea that the Gospels were written by the people whose names are on them, that they are written with information about Jesus, and that they're an accurate, at least a reliable account of what Jesus said. The alternative is the critical model, which denies a lot of that. So the standard model says Gospels are written by the evangelists whose names are on them. They're written at a date that's well within the lifetime of the apostles, so the apostles can contribute to them and they can comment on them. The writers had access to eyewitnesses. Some of them actually were eyewitnesses. Some of them talked to eyewitnesses. So we have eyewitness information in there. There are an accurate description of what they talk about. So when they talk about something in Jesus's life, they talk about it accurately. There might be a summary, but nonetheless, it's an accurate summary. And finally, the writers were guided by God in what they decided to write down. But the reliability is what we're going to look at in this presentation. The critics say, well, no, the gospel writers were written by other people. They weren't written by the people whose names are on them. Those names were added to the Gospels later on. They say they were written quite a lot later, and the apostles weren't around when the Gospels were written, and that they're written from a mix of different traditions. Rather than being written by people who saw what went on, they have some kind of source who probably hadn't seen Jesus either, going back for quite some time. And they basically saying that the gospel accounts aren't an accurate description of what Jesus did, but they are, for the main part, invented later. Some of them are perhaps go back to Jesus, but a lot of it is supposedly much later than Jesus and invented later. So the big proponent of this at the moment is a man called Bart D. Ehrman, an American, and he has sort of extended the model rather. He's taken all the critics and picked out the bits he likes from each one of them and put a model which is slightly different from the classical model here. So we start off with somewhere around 30 AD when Jesus starts to teach, and he teaches, of course, for 3.5 years, something like that. And then he's crucified, and the accounts are written down somewhat later. And in this model, there's then a tremendous amount of oral transmission. So the stories of Jesus are spread from one congregation to another by people who hadn't met Jesus, and they will hear it from somebody else who heard it from somebody else. And the idea is there are many, many different generations of this. So someone says something, they found a new congregation, the person is then relying on what they heard in the previous church that they came from, and perhaps every 6 months there's another person that moves it on and develops the tradition as the church grows. The stories are chosen because they deal with problems that the church had at the time, and new stories might be invented, or the stories might be changed to fit in the local circumstances. So the idea is that not only is there the possibility of misremembering, there actually are deliberate changes being put in there to adapt the story to the local situation. And then says Ehrman, somewhere between 70 and 100 AD, those traditions are written down, with Mark being the first person to write down, and John being the last of those. John writing somewhere between 90 and 100, he says. Some critics take this much later. I've heard people say the gospel was written as late as 150 AD, but Ehrman is relatively conservative in that he goes from 70 to 100. So we now have a set of written Gospels, but according to Ehrman, that isn't the end of it, because the written tradition changes. So as scribes copy out the Gospel, they will alter it a bit. And the alterations carry on until we get to middle of the 4th century. And really, you can't then, we've got substantial manuscripts in that time. For example, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, Aleph and B are the codes for them. And they're substantially the same as a modern text of the New Testament. So it looks like the written tradition is now fixed completely. And apart from misspellings and one or two things like that, there's no change carrying on. So that's the Ehrman model. So we've got changes in tradition, quite wild changes during the period of oral tradition, but we've got further changes actually after it's written down, and that gives him 3 centuries in which the gospel stories can develop, and he makes use of it. Problem is that the evidence is against that model. For example, if we look back to the period of written tradition, when the Gospels are written, we actually have a fair number of manuscripts from there. There we are, that 2nd century. We have 8 papyri, which 2 of them are fairly substantial. P66 is the Gospel of John, give or take a couple of pages that are missing and a bit worn off at the corner. P75 is most of Luke, misses the first bit of Luke, and John misses the last bit of John, but otherwise complete. And they're pretty much the same as a modern text of Luke or John, again, give or take the odd spelling mistake. And there are other papyrus fragments which are there in the 1st century. In the 2nd century. The 3rd century, we have a lot more. We've got 47 there. And again, the ones I've coloured in yellow are pretty substantial. The ones that have got a blue outline to them are from the start of that period, so they're just into the 3rd century, just after 200. And then same thing for the 4th century, the sort of early 4th century, got another 12 papyri. Some of them have dates which overlap into possibly the 3rd century, where for any document you can never be absolutely certain of its date unless someone wrote it on. The dating gives you a range, and some of those the range goes back into the 3rd century. But these are all written before the Council of Nicaea is the sort of cut-off point that I used for choosing when they are. The most likely date is before that. So we've got a fair number of manuscripts written there, and those manuscripts, well, first of all, the substantial ones show that the text is fixed to the equivalent of the modern text rather earlier than the big codices of the 4th century. That's the first thing we get. So we've got substantial texts somewhat earlier than you would guess by talking to the critics. And then you have all these other papyri with different fragments from before that time. I put a little box in for each of them. These are only fragments for the main part. The ones that are only fragments, it's pretty much a random bit that happens to have survived. There's a bias towards the middle of the Gospels. The front page and the last page are the most likely ones to get damaged. So there tends to be something of a cluster in the middle of the Gospel, but nonetheless, they aren't chosen because they are like modern texts. However, they are like modern texts. The evidence appears to be a random sample of bits from the New Testament, has the same text as a modern critical text of the New Testament. So there doesn't seem to be this development of text after the Gospels have been written down. We've got extra evidence on top of that. We've got translations into Latin. So there were a whole lot of translations into Latin. I think I have evidence of one which was in circulation in 96 AD. That's pretty speculative, but in the epistle of Clement to Corinth, written 96 to 98 AD, somewhere around that time. He quotes from the Gospel of Matthew, but he doesn't quote from the standard Greek we've got. What he quotes is something that seems to be a translation back from a Latin version. But these translations, there were a whole lot of them made. A whole lot of them have survived. There are probably even more made than have survived, but there are 20 or so that have survived. And it was such a hodgepodge of different versions, a bit like English nowadays, that in 400 AD, well, before that, slightly before that, Jerome was commissioned to write a standard Latin translation, which is the Vulgate, and these old Latin translations vanished. So these Latin translations are from before 400 AD, and a lot of them go back quite a long way. Again, they show the standard text. Slight variations, like any manuscript copy, but mostly spelling, slightly different wording. Nothing that you would really reckon to be much of a difference. And then we still haven't finished. On top of that, we've got citations. We've got places where the New Testament is quoted by ancient authors. Some of them as early as, well, 1 Clement's the earliest in 96, 98. We've got letters of Ignatius of Antioch, who quotes quite well. Polycarp quotes like mad all the time. He keeps on quoting. And carrying on to people like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and so on, all writing in the 2nd century and quoting the Bible tremendously. So again, we have these quotations, which mean that pretty much the whole of the New Testament is quoted from before the time of Nicaea, and it shows that the text hasn't changed, so that the manuscript evidence is overwhelming that there is no substantial change in the Gospels after they were written down by the people who wrote them. And now one other thing to it, the later manuscripts as well. So if you look at the manuscripts we've got from the 5th century or the 6th century or right to the 10th century, they're from all over Europe, Africa, the Middle East. They're absolutely distributed geographically. And it was very difficult for someone in Lyon, in France, to compare a manuscript with someone in the Sinai desert in a monastery. It was just a very difficult travel. So people copied independently from one another. Geographical independence is there, and they're all producing the same text. So it shows there weren't different texts around for different people from different times. So an early manuscript makes its way into Gaul. Other people from Gaul would then copy that. It's the same as the standard text. So we know that there isn't much variation from these later manuscripts as well. On top of that, Ehrman is really being a bit late with his dating of the New Testament. He's using the date accepted by a lot of modern scholars, but they accept it because other scholars have said it. It doesn't go back to the original data, actually having had a really serious survey of the dates of the Gospels. The people who have done that place the Gospels rather earlier than the people who are just looking at what other scholars have said on the subject. So we've got a date that's a bit earlier, because that gives more time for manuscript variation, but less time for oral variation before it. So the theory of a development after the Gospels are written just is overwhelmingly doesn't hold water. The manuscript evidence absolutely finishes that theory. Ehrman should know that. He's quite a respectable biblical textual critic in his own right. I think where this idea of how the Gospels develop comes from, and it starts off, well, you can get right back into the 16th century, but really, a chap called Herman Remarius is the man who launches it off, and he's into the Enlightenment. He rejects any kind of idea of a miracle, and he likes to think that Jesus was a political figure, and he writes a book, but it's never published in his lifetime, and in the 1760s, it's published after his death, 1763, and it starts off a way of looking at the Gospels. And what happens is people say, well, the real Jesus wasn't like the Jesus of the Gospels. And they talk about the historical Jesus, the Jesus of history, the person who really existed. And people write biographies of Jesus, usually on almost zero evidence, but they produce these lives of Jesus, and they're not like the Jesus of the Gospels. And they make Jesus a political revolutionary, or they make him an Enlightenment philosopher. They make him a cynic. They make him a wandering teacher, wandering philosopher, and so on. But they don't have him as the Jesus of the Gospels. These lives of Christ, what they then do is they say, well, we know what the truth is, not sure how, some kind of historical intuition, I suppose, and we've got to account for why the Gospels are different. And they produce something called the Quest for the Historical Jesus. It's now known as the First Quest for the Historical Jesus, because people had other goes at it later on. And it starts off with Remarius, and it carries on going quite strongly up to 1900. There's then problems with it, but it actually carries on for quite a little bit in a sort of quiet kind of way after that. Big figures with it. There's a chap called Ferdinand Bauer, who sees Jesus as a Hegelian philosopher, rather curious. Hegel decided that he knew how history ought to develop, and had phenomenal influence in the 19th century. He's the man who produced the philosophy that Marxism is based on as well, for example. Ferdinand Bauer, that is, not Hegel, produces the idea that Paul teaches a totally different kind of Christianity from Jesus. The two are struggling with one another, and then Catholicism, he talks about, is a compromise between Paul and Jesus, having a bit of both. Completely wrong, but that's his idea. And there's a chap called David Strauss, who is the starter of the Tübingen school. There's already a school of philosophy in Tübingen, and it's already fairly skeptical, shall we call it. But Strauss really gets it going, and this school at Tübingen University produces a whole lot of different critical writings on the New Testament. Again, based on this first quest idea, we know what Jesus was like, and we're going to get rid of any part of the Gospels that doesn't agree with that. We say that that's a later addition, and the only historical bedrock is the bit that agrees with us, and sometimes we have to change it a bit for that as well. Well, that falls over rather in the early 1900s. 1906, Albert Schweitzer publishes a book, and he notes that the people in the first quest choose a Jesus who looks like them. So if they're Marxist revolutionaries, they have a Marxist revolutionary Jesus. If they are philosophers, Jesus becomes a philosopher, and so on. And he says, you're just projecting yourself back and trying to say the New Testament's like me, and get rid of any bit that isn't. And that has a lot of force to it. And the first quest grinds to a halt. Again, there are a few people who keep it going, but it's really over by that stage. And we get in the 1920s and 30s a chap called Rudolf Bultmann, who is an existentialist as well as a theologian. And he says it doesn't matter whether Jesus, well, all we need to know is he existed, maybe that he was crucified, and that he's God. That's all you need to know about Jesus. And the rest of it is unimportant. And there's no point in looking for historical accuracy in the Gospels. They're just nice stories based on these three facts. That's Bultmann's idea. Again, evidence doesn't support him, but that's what he said, and it was getting very influential in the 1950s, even in the 1960s. But in the 1950s, there's another chap who introduces another go to get to the historical Jesus, and he produced a second quest. It carries on for a little while. He manages to enthuse people, but it's very like the first quest. It goes nowhere very much. But finally, there's a third quest which is going up now. That's based on the idea you can set out clear criteria to decide whether something's historical or not. And they're now going over. They've noticed that a lot of what Jesus says reads very nicely if you translate it back into Aramaic, and you look for linguistic fossils. You start looking for criteria like is this something that's been recorded that the church wouldn't like to hear, in which case why would the church record it unless it's accurate, and so on. And so people are looking on specific criteria rather than the previous two quests where they just ad hoc said, well, I don't think that looks very good to me, I think we'll leave it out. Third quest is at least putting up rational criteria. It's still, I think, well, it's got something useful to say. All of them do, but I don't think it's going to produce the truth very easily without going for more evidence than they're using. Now, at the same time, sort of after 2000, you get the modern atheist movement. New atheism appears to have died, but the new atheists have gone over to this critical skepticism or skeptical criticism, and are pushing that as their attack on Christianity, which is somewhat different, and I think rather connected to the culture wars going on in America at the moment. But that's the how the attack on the gospel is developing. So the different kinds of criticism we've got, let's look at the different schools. First one is called form criticism, and that's the idea that it starts off with Jesus teaching in Galilee, teaches going to Judea, occasionally in Jerusalem, and teaching there. And a church then forms which tries to follow Jesus's teaching, and it passes on Jesus' teaching orally. So the people actually knew Jesus will tell somebody else. As they find a new congregation, or someone will go out there, start teaching the stories of Jesus, and so on. But the stories of Jesus are altered, and when they're told, people remember different bits of them. There's just an ordinary sort of Chinese whispers, what the Americans call telephones, game going on, and people are losing information, and they're adding extra bits to it. And sometimes the interests of the church that they're in make them invent another story, and so on. So some stories are actually invented, and we end up with a picture of Jesus which 40 years, 50 years after the crucifixion of Jesus are pretty different from what actually happened. But these accounts are then collected. So Mark, or whoever it is that wrote the Gospel of Mark, goes into a church, sits there and writes down the stories that are being told in that church, puts them into some kind of order, and that's the Gospel of Mark. Matthew, a little bit later, does the same thing in a different church, and Luke does it in a different church, and so on. There's some connection between them because they pick similar accounts. They pick accounts for similar events, but nonetheless, it's really this sort of folk tradition analyzed using studies on German folk stories passed around in the 19th century. So finally, these written accounts that have been collected are combined, made into proper gospels, and that's what we've got. So we've got a picture of Jesus' actions. We've got this tremendous amount of confused oral passing on of the tradition, which is then written down as the various different gospels. Problem with it, there isn't the time for that to happen. If you look at when the Gospel of Mark must have been written, about 50 AD, well, that's 20 years after the resurrection, and really there isn't time to develop a whole gospel full of stories by then. Not only that, there are people still alive who were alive at the time of Jesus. A lot of people still alive who were alive at the time of Jesus, and they can put right a story which is just invented from nowhere or which contains glaring errors, and these are going to be picked up. The other thing about it is that the stories would be generated by the church. Bits that belong to pre-70 AD Palestine would get lost. They'd be replaced by customs from the Greek area where the church developed. And the Gospels are very much embedded in the time of Jesus in Judea and in Galilee at the time when Jesus was teaching. The details of what was going on, the kind of customs, the architecture, it all fits that period. It doesn't fit later ideas of Asia Minor, say, or Greece, where the bulk of the church was by that stage. The other way of explaining it is called documentary hypothesis, also known as source criticism. And there's the idea that there are two documents that underline most of the other two synoptic gospels. So the Gospel of Mark is written first, and there's another document which is designated Q from the German word Quelle, which means source. And the idea is that Matthew's gospel contains a lot of material that comes straight from Mark. So Matthew copies down Mark, but he alters it as he goes. Luke does the same thing. They both have access to this document Q. They copy bits out of that, again, altering it as they go along. And then there's some bit that's just from in Matthew, which either Matthew got orally, or maybe he's using another document which only he has access to. And there's stuff in Luke that only comes in Luke, which probably doesn't therefore come from, well, obviously doesn't come from Mark, probably doesn't come from Q. And Luke has put that in on top. And that's another idea of how the Gospels are written. Now, interesting point. First of all, this means that there are Gospels, there are written documents even earlier than the Gospels. So things like Q is going to be even closer to Jesus than Matthew and Luke are. So it doesn't necessarily mean the Gospels will be unreliable. It's usually mixed in with a bit of source criticism to suggest unreliability, but it doesn't on its own indicate unreliability. When you start doing word counts and looking at parallel accounts, the similarity between the different accounts is a lot less than you think. So the bits of Matthew that also appear in Mark, the wording is quite often substantially different. The story might be the same story, but there'll be different words, there'll be synonyms, there are different words that mean the same thing. The description of what happens will amount to the same thing, but done in different words, and so on. The words of Jesus tend to be much more similar. There are one or two places that are very similar, but mostly they're quite different. And the same is true with Luke. So the evidence for copying from another document is very poor. The critics say, oh, well, they copied from Mark, but he altered it. You say, well, if he altered it, is he copying? Good question. And of course, it's fitting this into the time available. There isn't really the time there. When these ideas were invented, people thought the Gospels were written 200, 300 AD, very late. Now we know we've got enough papyrus fragments of them to know they were written a lot earlier. So there's the problem of time as well. And then there's the hybrid model, where you start off with the work of Jesus, you get oral traditions, which then are collected into single accounts. So the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 will be written down as a standard document, perhaps. Maybe there'll be two or three alternative accounts of it. And then those are collected together to make Gospels or Gospel-like documents, which are then used to develop the later Gospels. So they put together the different ideas of both source criticism and form criticism together to make one picture. I think Ehrman's in there as well. But the trouble is that squashing that into the time is even more difficult than it is for the documentary model, which is hard enough. And again, if it's all invented by a Greek-speaking church, why is it so Semitic? Why is it so Aramaic in its background? And of course, you've got to replace quite a simple hypothesis. People who knew what happened, wrote it down, passed it round, to something really complicated instead. Why pick a complicated explanation for something you can explain very simply? So let's look at how it works. What the sceptical critics are still saying is they know what Jesus was like. Didn't do miracles. His teaching probably wasn't that like the teaching of the gospel. They don't like that, so we'll pick something we do like. That's the original assumption that's made in the 19th century. It's still being made now by the skeptics. There's this bias against supernatural events, saying that anything with a miracle has got to be wrong. It's got to be invented later. Again, it's an assumption. And so they say the real Jesus is quite different from the Jesus of the Gospels. And they're saying they know what the real Jesus was like. Of course, if the Gospels are wrong, we don't know very much about Jesus. We know a bit, but not a lot. And so they say there's a huge gap between the Gospels and Jesus, and they are scrabbling around for a mechanism to explain it. And that's where the skeptic ideas come from. It's because they are desperate for this mechanism, and it's still the same driving force. That's what drove the people in 1800, and it's what's driving the people in 2023. But even though the original assumption that we know the real Jesus was like is rather gone, it's still the things that follow from it still remain. They're still there as assumptions. But the evidence is in favor of what I call the standard model, the traditional model. There's very little evidence to support the critical ideas. There's a few bits that are brought out and pushed for all it's worth, but you'll find that everyone who talks about it produces this same very small bit of evidence, which is susceptible to other explanations as well. And quite often the analyses that you get are based on ideas that haven't been looked at, that people haven't done the word counts, they haven't done the detailed comparison. They're relying on somebody else who's relying on somebody else who goes back to the 19th century where the man has plucked it out of the air. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence which supports the standard model. We've got papyri, we've got citations in early writings. We know what type date the Gospels are written. We've got the language that the Gospels are written in. Speech patterns of Jesus. Jesus tells parables. Nobody else does. They don't get parables in the letters. You don't get parables in the early church fathers. Jesus is a parable writer, parable speaker in a way that nobody else is. And you have to say, why? Why don't you've got 4 Gospels with parables in, mostly in 3 of them, but the odd parable in John as well, or parable-like saying. And finally, you've got references in early church writers as to what the Gospels are like, which support the standard model. So there's lots of evidence that supports the standard model, very little that support the critical models. So conclusion, most of it is caused by quoting somebody, some expert who's quoting an earlier expert, who's quoting an earlier expert, who's quoting a wild guess from the 19th century. It's become an assumption in the 19th century. It's got enshrined as though it was a fact, but in fact, it doesn't come from any kind of evidence. And again, quite often the original assumptions have gone. People have forgotten their assumptions, but the results are so ingrained in what's being taught in theological colleges and universities that they're taken as facts. So the modern skeptics are working from a basis that has very little evidence to support it, but it's copying up. The atheists are quoting it like mad. You can go on the internet and look for some of these ideas, and you'll find that they're all over it. Progressive Christians, rather interestingly, are picking up the same ideas. They're taking them as though they were correct, and they're pushing them forward. There's a certain, it's become part of the culture war in America, and people who want to be Christians and part of that side of the culture war are using biblical criticism as well. And the Roman Catholic Church often picks up these ideas as a way of attacking the Bible and trying to show that the church is prior to the Bible. So there we go.